Some observers are saying that the next lockdown announcement could be a watershed moment for President Cyril Ramaphosa, saying as the pressure builds up, it's reached the pinnacle, saying that there is more patients and some are still left in the dark. But to find out what the ramifications are for this, we're joined now by Ms. Lebohang Pheko, who is a research fellow at the Trade Collective. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for joining us, Ms. Pheko. The use of the word, just talking about that, the use of that is a watershed moment. Is that an exaggeration, or is it just how much pressure is being brought to bear on the president?
Well, I mean, the lockdown or the quarantine, the curfew, basically we're under martial law, should bear that in mind, has caused quite a decline in economic activity, of course, and the contractions in the GDP have ranged from about between 5.8%, according to some of the financial publications, to over 10%. And of course, on Wednesday, the South African Reserve Bank updated its projection for a decline in GDP growth from 7% to about 6.1%, and they also tried to cut the repo rate points to try to galvanize the economy a bit further, to make borrowing a bit more amenable, to ensure that house prices and repayment loan costs are not as onerous on consumers. So, I mean, I don't know at the moment, but the pressure is quite high on the economy, and I think that one of the things that we've been discussing, and it's a very uncomfortable conversation, but there will be casualties in this. There will be there will be a cost of human life in this, and I think what the government, and it's not only South Africa, what governments across the world are balancing very delicately and with great difficulty in many instances is when and how. So whether the healthcare system is able to support this, whether the economy is able to absorb the cost of the cost of these deaths, whether the economy is also able to absorb the cost of loss, especially in terms of interest rates, in terms of market activity, share prices, and so on. And what is really unfortunate is, of course, other than that, a lot of this is to do with the structural deficits and flaws in our economy. The fact that most countries, including South Africa, have fairly neglected public sector infrastructure, particularly in the area of healthcare. What Level 3 does offer, however, is the possibility for opening up a bit more, opening up the education sector, opening up some other sectors of the economy, opening up some sectors as well of real estate, for example, open up in the realms of travel, domestic travel, as well as other forms of manufacturing, which will then be allowed to run at 50% capacity, as opposed to the 1/3 capacity that has been regulated at the moment. So, I mean, there's quite a bit that could potentially open up.
So let's talk about the opening up, Ms. Pheko. You spoke about the casualties, and I mentioned that some people say that there is a growing lack of patience. Is that justified, and would there be a political fallout, or would there be political casualties, and would the president himself find himself in that dragon's net?
Well, it depends who the casualties are. Let's just start there. So if the casualties are really some of the corporates and some of the, I think, the less entitled members of society whose main interest actually is ensuring that it's business as usual, and this cannot be business as usual. This is business unusual, and I think that what's very unfortunate as well is that a lot of these companies sculpt huge amounts of taxes, often and sometimes unpaid taxes from various countries, and I think that if those are the casualties, or if those are the ones who are squealing, I have very little sympathy for that constituency. If, of course, the other people who are the complainants would be people in communities such as high-density townships, rural communities, where we've already seen over the past 50, what day are we on now? But I mean, the past almost 2 months, that these structural faults that I've been talking about, these structural fault lines, are extremely evident. Lack of water, high density, low possibility of social distancing, and of course, very low possibilities of gaining of income generation, especially for people who work in the parallel or the adjacent economies. Then, those are the people who I think that we need to pay far more attention to. With the political fallout, I don't have the crystal ball at the moment, but I do think that it's a good opportunity to be fairly, not cautiously congratulatory of the president and of the way that the South African government have handled this. And I mean, I think credit where credit is due. I'm as tough a critic as any, but I think that's also in the spirit of real patriotism. And I think that in this instance, when one looks across the Atlantic and even looks across, Europe and so on, we've been very much undersung in the way that this pandemic has been handled. Of course there are toothaches. Of course there are difficulties. Of course there's been police brutality. Of course it has not been a seamless process. Of course it shows that there's an inherent DNA in some instances of state brutality across many countries. But I do think that certainly if there's a fallout, it will be extremely unfair.
We've seen the opposition parties reacting to the ratings agencies and they're keeping, in some cases, us at sub-investment grade, but saying that there will be further reduction of South Africa's investment status if we do not have real structural reform, and yet at the same time,
I think I'm very cautious. Sorry, Ms. Mogwetla. I think I'm very cautious about the ratings agencies, and I think historically I have been, for various reasons. They've been wrong on many occasions, and secondly, I think that really, given the bizarre climate that they're in, for them to actually pronounce on anything during such a time of abnormality is rather irresponsible, to say the least. I also think that we should be reminded as South Africans and as African citizens across this continent that we don't vote for ratings agencies. We vote for states, we vote for governments, and we need to bear pressure on them to disperse and to distribute the benefits and the access to the economy, not ratings agencies. And I think that that's incredibly anti-democratic, and it's also bizarre because those are opaque processes. Ratings agencies don't live on Mars. They're not special people who are imbued with supernatural intelligence. They have made several mistakes. Countries such as China, even the European Union, and by the way, even the US were very offended under Obama when they themselves raided by one of the ratings agencies. So I think that frankly, they are not Jesus Jr. And I think that we need to think about ways in which we can regalvanize and bring credibility to our economies, but in contexts that belong to us.
And I want to talk about that credibility and the context. As I mentioned, the opposition party is talking about the need for real structural reform. At the same time, when we're talking about a level 3, the possibility thereof of the alcohol and tobacco industries, for instance, maybe not being part of that. From which standpoint are people really talking about structural reform, and is it really real? Is it sincere?
Yeah, I mean, I think those are two slightly separate questions, but I think that the one is that the structural reform is really to do with the source of opening up the economy and making a connection between financial infrastructure, development infrastructure, and social infrastructure, and that connect hasn't been made. So remember that for the 2010 World Cup, we built lots of infrastructure, hardly any of it which is being used. We have, a clutch of unused or underutilized stadiums in this country. So I think when we talk about structural reform, we need to think about it in a developmental mode, and be very clear that infrastructure that doesn't serve the majority of people in this country. So affordable public transport. Taxis are not public transport. Let's be clear; those are privately owned enterprises. So affordable and accessible transport, accessible energy, the energy complex. So that includes electricity, that includes access to cheap fuel that is safe, not necessarily only paraffin. That also includes in this day and age, I would certainly argue that data and Wi-Fi, cheap or free Wi-Fi, is a human need, particularly if we're in a situation where a lot of more of our work and our lives are going to move online going forward for the foreseeable future. We've been talking about the digital economy and crossing the digital divide for a very long time. Why we haven't done so is really something that remains quite mysterious.
Thank you so much for speaking to us and your insights. Ms. Lebohang Pheko is Senior Researcher at the Trade Collective. Her views on the position the country finds itself in. President Cyril Ramaphosa, as he continues his consultations with various sectors of society that it places on him as we are a week away from the proposed level 3 lockdown.